at, you can see that the program has, in fact, their profiles. So we won't take time from them, as I'm taking some as it is now. But I just want to, what I want to do is introduce just the speakers and their titles and ask them to follow each other so we can just slide right in. So our first speaker is Giuliano Santangeli Valenzani, who teaches at the Università, Roma 3, and you can see he's going to speak to us on a hospitable, heartfelt welcome awaits you, advertising Italy to American tourists in post-war United States, 1949 to 1960. And he'll be followed by Carla Francellini from the Università di Siena and Sabrina Vellucci from l'Università Roma 3. And there's his artistic self-acknowledgement through recognized institutions, the case of Mary Caponegro. And then afterwards, we'll save time for questions and answers. Prego.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Tamburri. And before I start my presentation, I'd like obviously to take a moment to thank everyone involved in the organization of this conference, and obviously to thank the Sorbello Foundation for the research grant that give me the opportunity to tackle the exciting topic of Italian tourism advertising in post-war Italy. And actually, I undertook this research starting from the realization that within historical studies on Italian tourism, there is this curious lack of attention to the period immediately following World War II, between the late 1940s and the late 1950s. Yet, obviously, the historical importance of that moment is self-evident. The establishment of the Cold War system, the economic boom, the consolidation of the Atlantic Alliance, and obviously also the period of the most intense American anti-communist. And this situation intersected with a great revolution in the world of international tourism. Mass tourism started to become the driving force of Western leisure travel, thanks mostly to faster and cheaper international air routes and to the diffusion of package tours sold by organizations like the agency, travel agency, and so on. And Italy, mostly right after the war, immediately start to saw tourism, international tourism, as a quick way to rebuild its economy and also to rebuild its standing in the international consensus, I would say. And the United States, from its part, also saw tourism as a useful tool for promoting economic growth and stability in Europe, and also to exporting American values and culture abroad. And so, given this situation, two questions closely related to each other arise. The first is, what images did Italy use to promote itself in the United States at this moment in time? What themes, images, ideas were being used by ENIT, Ente Nazionale Industrie Turistiche, to sell Italy to American visitors? I have to make a point right away. Tourist promotion is obviously a complex issue, a complex matter that involves different actors, private companies, governments, promotional agency, travel agency, and so on. But in my research, I focus only on the official tourism organization of the Italian government, ENIT. And the other research question is from the opposite point of view, that means from the American point of view. Can tourism help to shed a light on American perception on Italy, about Italy? American tourists returning from Italy during the 1950s, for example, or authors, American authors of travel guides, American authors of travel articles, what did they think of Italy right after World War II and during the 1950s? Before going into detail, however, it is worth spending a few words on the protagonist of Italian tourist promotion during the 1950s, which is the Ente Nazionale per le Industrie Turistiche, ENIT. The history of ENIT is a fairly complex one and full of major changes over time. The agency was founded in 1919 after World War I, but it did not begin to really get involved in tourism advertising until 1926. At that point, however, the agency was completely fascist, as a part, an agency of the Mussolini's regime. And after the war, ENIT passed under the control of the Council of Ministers, and then in 1947, it became an executive body of a new High Commissioner for Tourism wanted by the Gasperis government. And ENIT tourist promotion to the United States certainly did not start after the war. Indeed, since the 1920s, since its start, ENIT had been acting in the United States market with good results. Promotional activities then resume their natural course around 1949, when Italy returned actively to promote itself in the United States with advertising. In 1949, for the first time since the war, an ENIT office abroad was opened in the United States, in the city of New York, and was managed by this woman, Miss Manolita Dolger, this energetic Italian-American with a lot of previous experiences in various Italian-American organizations during the war. Later, other ENIT offices were opened in the United States, first in Chicago and San Francisco, and eventually also in New Orleans, in the state of Louisiana. So covering basically all the geographical region of the United States. These offices did not directly produce tourism advertisement, but they were responsible for the distribution of advertisement and informative materials, both to the press, the American press, and to the American public. And available data on the extent of ENIT promotional campaigns in the United States during the 1950s reveal two major aspects. First, that Italy was aiming especially at the American market. The United States was the main target of Italian tourist promotion during the 1950s. The second aspect is that Italian tourism professionals had still great problems in understanding the American tourist market. It was very new, very complex for the traditional Italian advertising sector. And actually, since ENIT was obviously an extension also of the Italian business sector and was closely tied to the Democrazia Cristiana party in Italy, the very first concern of ENIT right after the war was to make it clear to the American public that Italy needed Marshall Plan aid. And that Italy sided with the United States in the Atlantic front. In this regard, for example, ENIT's main English language publication, called Italy's Life, acted as a genuine pro-Marshall Plan manifesto between 1947 and 1949. This publication, in fact, between 47 and 49, and only during these 3 years, had the explicit subtitles of a journal, a magazine dedicated to Italian and cultural and business relations. Only in 1950, in the year 1950, did this wording disappear from the publication, since by then, obviously, Italy had already gained access to the Marshall Plan aid. Incidentally, unlike any other ENIT publications, Italy's Life began as an English-only magazine just for the United States, and only over 10 years, only over the next 10 years, were French, German, and even Italian version added. This shows, obviously shows that at this early stage, ENIT aimed mostly to serve as an instrument to rapprochement between Italy and America. The articles in these early issues of Italy's Life, published between 1947 and 1948 and early 1949, for the most part depicted an impoverished, a very poor Italy in need of American help. What is more, explicit references were made to the fondness of the liking that allegedly all Italians felt for the United States and for the Americans. One article is emblematic in this regard, the article wrote by Natalia and Mario Lugaro. And it is no coincidence that this article was published in March 1948, which means right before the Democrazia Cristiana won the election in Italy. The article is presented as a true journalistic inquiry in which the author simply asked a number of Italians from different walks of life what they thought of Americans and what they thought about the United States. And they all are very enthusiastic about the United States. They all were very enthusiastic about the American people. Only the last respondent, a blue-collar worker, described with the Unità in his pocket, the Unità is the newspaper from the Communist Party in Italy, described in the article in a somewhat grotesque fashion, even his physical appearance, is the only one who said that he hates the United States and that he that he thinks that President Truman wants to enslave the Italians. However, at the end of this late 1940s interlude related to the Marshall Plan, Enid took steps to revive an image of Italian economy stability. Italy's life now fully celebrated the end of the post-war reconstruction, and the magazine's message became totally on the positive side, resuming a more traditional promotional discourse that is presenting a happy country, a united country, rich in art, rich in culture, rich in natural beauty. And already in 1950, in the year 1950, Italy's life announced to the American public that the reconstruction was over, thanks mostly to the United States. So having secured its position in the Atlantic front and partially having complete its reconstruction, Italy started its first truly major promotional campaign abroad in the year 1950. This campaign involves the publication of more than 2,400 different advertisements in 29 different countries. However, it was not until 1951 that a special promotional program was launched for the United States and only for the United States. This campaign involved 8,000 American newspapers and magazines with the publication of 60 different advertisements. And this campaign had been strongly encouraged by the United States itself, eager to send as many tourists to Italy as possible. In the hearings before the Committee on Foreign Affairs, in the Committee on Foreign Affairs of March 1950 in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., it was pointed out that the Marshall Planners had strongly pushed Italy to start immediately this extensive tourist campaign in the United States, moreover suggesting the use of American advertising agencies and not Italian advertising agencies, as they were considered most effective on the American market. And finally, in 1957, the Italian High Commissioner for Tourism, Pietro Romani, launched a further increase in advertising spending just for the United States and the Canadian market. Consider that by mid-1950s, 65% of all the budget spent by Enid for advertisement abroad was allocated just for the United States. So this shows how much importance was given to attracting well-spending American visitors during the 1950s, more than from any other international country. And this might seem like a particularly extensive effort, actually, but in fact, when compared to other European nations, Italian advertising expense in America appears somewhat modest. In 1958, for example, even after the increase in expenditures wanted by Pietro Romani, the amount spent by Enid in the United States had been of just $380,000, which means well below the amount spent by countries such as France, the United Kingdom, even West Germany, and more in par with Switzerland, for example. In 1953 already, in fact, Enid conducted a study on the United States market which revealed that the budget for foreign promotion in the United States was significantly inadequate at this point. However, the budget was not the only problem for ENIT in the United States. At this point, in the early 1950s, the Italian tourism industry had already developed a great awareness of what the main problems were for Italian tourism promotion, especially in the United States. In addition to a budget shortage, in fact, there were problems related precisely to the country's image abroad. Italy, for example, feared that it would continue to be perceived as a worn-torn, poor country with old infrastructures. Another issue arose due to Italy's image being perceived by the Italian tourist professional as excessively linked to the theme of history and culture, paradoxically enough. In their opinion, the fact that Italy was associated mostly with history and culture proved to be harmful in the new mass tourist market of the 1950s. An excerpt from an article written by Ugo Manunta, the article was in English, I translated in Italian in this slide. This article by Ugo Manunta, published in Italy's Life in 1953, highlights this concern about Italy being too linked to history and culture, and the need to find new themes to promote the country abroad. And actually both Italy's Life, the magazine of ENIT, and the print advertisement published in the newspapers during the 1950s would attempt to solve this problem by adding, even in a confused manner, many different aspects of Italy promotion. ENIT also found itself pondering structural problems during the 1950s regarding advertisements in the United States. There is a very interesting document on this issue, which is the Conference of ENIT Delegates Abroad, held in October 1959 in Rome. 21 directors of different ENIT offices abroad met in Rome to discuss Italian advertisement and Italian promotion abroad. What I find interesting is that the real protagonists of this meeting were indeed the 4 directors of ENIT offices in the United States, and especially Ms. Manolita Dolger, which I showed earlier. Dolger took the floor on the first day of conference and explained that ENIT advertisements weren't good enough for the United States. She explained that the advertising strategies that work elsewhere in the world were not suitable for the United States. She mentioned, for instance, the need for new types of advertisements with much more photos and less textual part and less text. She also emphasized the necessity of providing Americans with a map of Italy in every advertisement to show the country, to show the various locations, because she said, and I quote, the average American was not familiar with European geography yet. Dolger also attempted a psychological description of the average American. She explained that the American is, and I quote, someone open, simple in his reaction and ideas, someone who is highly predisposed to be influenced in his choices by advertising campaigns. And finally, in a typical American advertising fashion, she urged everyone in the room to immediately read a newly published book on advertising persuasion techniques called The Hidden Persuader, to improve their understanding about how advertising works. Following her speech, Dr. Luigi Chilleri, which was the director of ENIT Chicago, explained that the differences between the United States and Europe also involves the operation of travel agencies. Indeed, he explained that in the United States, travel agents were not just ticket sellers to the public, but also organizers of long and complex tours. Therefore, he said, ENIT needed to produce specific advertising material just for the American travel agents to assist them in organizing these complex tours of Italy and Europe. And then Aurelia Alost, the director of ENIT New Orleans, also spoke of technical innovation in advertising that would be advisable to introduce immediately in future ENIT campaigns in the United States. So at the end of the 4 days of conference, Roberto De Gasperi, the director of ENIT propaganda section, the chief of ENIT propaganda, explicitly acknowledged that after hearing the delegates from the United States, he had become convinced that, and I quote, the mentality of the inhabitants of the United States is very different from that of Europeans. And thus, ENIT, he continued, needed to engage in specific promotional activities for the North American market with different contents and structures than those from the rest of the world, than mostly Europe at that point. And in fact, if we compare these suggestions from the ENIT delegates in America with the advertisements actually published on American newspapers and magazines during the 1950s, we find that they did not reflect those standards. From a formal point of view, the very first ENIT ads on the American market were still very similar to those produced during the fascist regime. And this is, on this slide you have an example. On the left, the advertisement is from 1937, and on the right is one of the first new ENIT ads published after the World War II. During the 1950s, there was somehow the ads changed, following somehow the example of American advertising, but it's only from 1960, from the year 1960, that this advertising drastically changed, somehow following this suggestion from the ENIT delegates in the United States, bigger photo, smaller text, the map of Italy always showing the ads. Mostly these 1950s ads tried to respond to those image problems that the Italian tourism industry considered most pressing in the American market. The first was certainly the idea that Italy was perceived as a poor country still at the end of the 1950s, actually. The print advertisements, in fact, and especially in the first half of the 1950s, pressed mainly on three different themes in their textual parts. These were the excellent quality of hotel facilities, the excellent quality of transportation, and the stores full of all commodities, and restaurants full of food. Consider that still between 1949 and 1950, Manolita Dolger, the director of ENIT in New York, had to dispel this rumor circulating in the United States that claimed that being Italy so poor, American tourists in vacation in Italy were taking the bread out of the mouth of hungry Italians. The other major theme adopted by ENIT in this period was the value of the dollar in Italy, which served to stimulate the arrival of Americans from the middle or lower middle economic class, and which obviously served also to make Italy more competitive with other cheaper European destinations in the new tourist market of post-war era, such as Spain, for example, or even Greece, and so on. As for the rest, many other themes were mentioned in the advertisements. This was in fact the idea of the so-called variety trope, which is a name adopted by tourism study to which means that the need stands for the need for tourism advertising in the mass tourist market to link a destination to any possible type of attraction in order to avoid losing any market segment. Italy was obviously embracing the trend also to disconnect from excessive emphasis on the cultural historical theme, which in fact is put in the background both in the ads that in Italy's Life, for example. In short, Italian advertising were now tied mostly to the economic theme of convenience and affordability rather than to any specific tourist attractions or themes. And at this point, the question must be asked, what kind of results did ENIT get from this kind of promotion? What response there was in terms of arrivals from the United States during the 1950s? Well, actually, the results were not so great as one might imagine. During the post-war economic recovery, there was this exaggerated belief that American tourists were invading Italy. However, official ENIT statistics show that between 1947 and 1950, Americans only accounted for annually for 5% or less than all the arrivals from abroad in Italy. However, before World War II, between the late 1920s and the 1930s, Americans had accounted for between 10% or even 16% of all entries in Italy. Of course, it is true that taken just numerically, there were many more Americans traveling now than before, but in proportion, they accounted for a smaller slice now than before for international arrivals in Italy. Americans also tended to concentrate in the same very few traditional Italian destinations such as Venice, Tuscany, mostly Florence, Rome and Naples, where most of all the other international tourists were concentrated also. I made this map based on ENIT data referring to the presence of Americans in Italian hotels. All ENIT promotion, however, clashed with a very important problem, which was the pre-existing image of Italy and Italians in the American mindset. This is the second aspect of my research, which I would necessarily have to present synthetically today for time constraint, but there is an extensive bibliography about the opinions of American travelers during the 19th century, for example, and especially since many of them were part of the American elite, the American establishment, or great intellectuals, and so they left quite a bit of information about their travels. We are also familiar with Anglo-Saxon travel guides published in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and so it is well known that for Americans, Italy had been traditionally a double destination, an ambiguous destination. It was obviously considered beautiful and culturally rich, perhaps the most beautiful, perhaps the most culturally rich country in Europe, but it was also considered violent, backward, underdeveloped, and the Italians had been considered a passionate, interesting people, but also naturally violent, lazy, childish, incapable of self-control. Now, it is interesting to note that this situation remains substantially unchanged throughout the 1950s. American visitors and American authors of travel articles and travel guides continue to portray an image of Italy that changed little or nothing from the traditional one. The new political and social context of the post-war era hardly changes the imagery associated with Italy and Italians. I analyze about 100 travel articles about Italy published in American magazines, mostly on Holiday, Saturday Review, and National Geographic, and on American newspapers between 1948 and 1960s, as well as 10 different travel guides published in the United States during the 1950s. What comes out is still this double portrait of Italy. The country was obviously still described and celebrated as unique and beautiful. However, negative aspects were constantly highlighted. Here, for example, is a series of short examples of travel writings on the theme of Italy as what is called the tragic country with a smiling face, which means a country populated by this naive, always cheerful people despite their subnormal living condition, despite their poverty. Just as in the 19th century, they were all obviously in English in original and translated in Italian. Just as in the 19th century, moreover, we still see in this period, during the 1950s, a real obsession with classifying different types of Italians. American tourists and travel writers seems most interested in finding the differences between the Italians of various regions. Here in the slide, I've put a couple of examples. In so many cases during the 1950s, one finds this long list of character and physical attributes of Italians described in the travel articles, often region by region. People from Venezia is made one way, people from Umbria is made another way, people from Sicilia is still different, and so on. In many cases, there are even grotesque physical description, often merciless physical descriptions of Italians. Here in the slide, you have one of these physical description quote from a tourist guide published in New York City in 1944 about the Romans, people from Rome. And when it came to southern Italy or Sardinia, a whole series of clichés and beliefs about the character of southern Italians was added. Certainly, I suspect that many of these beliefs and clichés about southern Italians were just repetition of old ideas developed in the United States about immigrants arrived at the turn of the century in the United States. Then mass tourism and a new style in travel writing also led to an explicit sexualization of American tourism in Italy. In many cases, the object of the attentions of tourists or travel writers were just Italian women. Travel articles often went into detail describing Italian women from a physical point of view. The idea is that the Italian people are naturally seductive and that the tourist, especially the American male tourist, will have in Italy several opportunities for romantic rendezvous, shall we say, mostly because of the alleged natural openness of Italian women that is highlighted in several cases. So the gaze of the American tourist remains in short ambiguous and skeptical about various manifestations of the Italian character, but what definitely changes is the position in which the American tourist perceives himself toward Italy. Early American travel literature, even when it expressed negative ideas about Italians, usually show almost an embarrassed admiration for the rich history, for the rich art, for the rich culture of Italy, with which the United States could not compete. In the 1950s, however, a sense of cultural revenge against Europe seems to have replaced this admiration. The American tourist began to conceive himself as coming from the center of the Western world, and by traveling to Europe, they were going towards the peripheral outskirts of that world. The American tourist had begun to perceive himself in a position of strength over European populations. This also thanks to the notion that by spending dollars in Italy, American tourists were helping Italian people and the reconstruction. This shift in perception is reflected in the comparison between the American tourist and the old pioneers of the West, which is found in several occasions in travel literature during the 1950s. The defense of the new American traveler / new American pioneer was also taken up by authors, such as, for example, John Steinbeck, who in 1956 wrote in the American travel magazine Holiday, criticizing old European prejudices towards his fellow Americans and criticizing the sense of guilt and embarrassment that American tourists had long had to suffer up to that time. Obviously, this changing perception of the American tourist in Italy reflects the changing dynamics between America and Europe in the post-war era, when America emerged as the dominant global power. To conclude, during the 1950s, American tourism in Italy was still in a phase closely tied with the traditional early 20th century tourism. American perception of Italy and Italians, moreover, continued to connect with traditional negative stereotypes. Even the promotional image chosen by Enid for the United States was not yet particularly elaborate. In fact, it was mostly this confused and generic image, a mix of many different themes, one next to the other. What is relevant, I think, is precisely the role that the United States played in this transitional period. Not only was America a strong economic sponsor of the upgrading of Italian tourism through the Marshall Plan, obviously, but then through private investments and also through the dollars spent by American tourists. But America was also such a new and different market for the Italian tourism advertising system that it prompted Italian tourists to rethink all its promotional forms and to look at American advertising as an example to follow. But most importantly, what really seems to be changing in that period is the self-perception of the American tourist and his approach to the old European world, which becomes a place to experience from a new position of not only economic but also cultural strength. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuliano. There are a couple of, I think we'll have a couple of questions, a couple of interesting points to raise. Prego.
Speak about for a short time for a general introduction about our project. But first of all, I want to join in thanking the Sorbello Foundation for honoring us with their fellowship and for giving us the chance to work on this project. And also thank you to Antonella Valoroso, who was very helpful throughout the process. And this is a huge, I would say, research project which has kept growing. So this feels more like a beginning rather than a conclusion after this year of research. And so we started from the much debated question of who the Italian-American writer is, or where he, she, or they are positioned in a contemporary canon. And we have addressed the activity in support of the literary field carried out by cultural institutions located both in the United States and Italy. And we have tried to address the impact of such efforts on the works by Italian-American authors. The institutions we have considered are the American Academy in Rome, the John D. Calandra Italian-American Institute, the Center for American Studies in Rome, New York University's Casa Italiana Zerilli Marimò, and the Centro Altre Italie per le Migrazioni Italiane in Turin. Oh, it's fine. So, of course, the list of eligible institutions is by no means complete, but for this study, we have focused on those organizations that consistently appear to have played a role in the careers of a representative group of US writers of Italian descent, or others otherwise connected with Italian culture. So, in this presentation, we will illustrate the very initial results of the research we conducted at the first two of these institutions, the American Academy and the John Calandra Institute. And we will present a case study that we consider as especially representative of our project. So as far as our corpus is concerned, we have included works by authors who might be comprised in the definition formulated by Anthony Tamburri in his essay on the Italian writer, wherein he highlights the necessity of broadening the concept of Italian identity, which currently is changing into something that goes beyond the traditional confines of that concept. This transformation results in an identity that can be defined effective, Tamburri writes, as you can read from the slide which I have translated, insofar as it recognizes that what an individual does within a largely Italian milieu unfolds in that way specifically because he or she feels their actions to be done Italianly as part of their ordinary existence, and not in any honorary or affected sense, but actually effective, such that whatever he or she does and knows as an Italian is part of the life of every day of that person. So a well-known case in point in this respect is that of Jhumpa Lahiri, who was hosted by the American Academy in Rome and has also been a regular attendee at the Center for American Studies in the last few years, and whose works epitomize a fundamental aspect of Italian diasporic writing, that is, Italian writing beyond Italy. Along the same lines, Jalal Qadir has noted that the term Italian, and you have another slide here that I have translated, at this historical juncture is no longer limited to populations in Italy and in the United States of America, with an Italian diaspora of over 60 million people around the planet, and with the term America no longer understood as referring exclusively to the United States, but extending to a bicontinental hemisphere, the international dimensions and discursive resonance of the binomial Italian-American can hardly be overlooked. So to be sure, in the last 2 decades or so, an increasing number of scholars have pointed out that for such an expanded understanding of both the terms Italian and American, a new cartography is needed that is consistent with the globality of what Italian-American means in the 21st century. So the endorsement of both creative and critical work by institutions such as the ones mentioned above may well be read as contributing to such a remapping of what these terms mean as transnational or transcultural phenomena. And it is from this perspective that we have explored their archives, searching for initiatives such as fellowships, awards, or other relevant events, and looking at their role in providing writers and poets with a web of cultural references and resources, which proved valuable also in terms of the authors developing self-awareness as writers of the Italian diaspora in the United States. As the case of Mary Caponegro will make clear, being hosted by these institutions made it possible for some of these artists to achieve a form of self-acknowledgement of their potential and talents, also as a result of being recognized or included as part of a community. As far as periodization is concerned, we have looked at the last 3 decades, with the notable exception of John Ciardi, who was a fellow at the American Academy in Rome in 1956-1957. So even considering such a relatively short time span as our research proceeded, it became clear to us that among the project's offshoots worthy of attention is not only the role these institutions have played as cultural mediators, but also the fact that, at least to our knowledge, they have never been studied in a comparative perspective. So let us briefly look at these, the first 2, which were hosts, in some cases both, for the writers we have focused on for our study, namely John Ciardi, Adria Bernardi, Dana Spiotta, Jennifer Scapettone, Jun Palairi, Claudia Durastanti, in addition to Mary Caponegro, about whom we are going to learn from Carla in a moment. The American Academy in Rome is a privately endowed postgraduate residential community of American artists and scholars. It was founded in 1894 and chartered by the US Congress in 1905 to aid the fine arts. Its purpose was broadened 8 years later through a charter amendment that recognized the importance of supporting not only artists, but also scholars in the humanities. Since 1951, it has granted a fellowship in writing with the aim of providing conditions that might be conducive either to creativity or research. The ultimate goal is, of course, that of reaching out to the communities these writers belong to and within which they act as catalysts. In addition to the Rome Prize, several distinguished artists and scholars have been invited over the years to spend varying periods of time either as residents or visitors. Poet John Ciardi came in 1956, as I said before, for a year, and he was the winner of the Rome Prize for Poetry. He was a well-known translator of Dante's Divine Comedy, and he was actually awarded the fellowship to work on his translation of the Purgatorio during that time. But he also wrote poems inspired by his Roman experience. His Fragments from Italy, a sequence of 8 deeply felt poems that move between Calabria, the Mediterranean Sea, Rome, and Naples, are the outcome of this activity he conducted during that year. Poems such as An Apartment with a View, Rome 1951, or Showing a Foreigner Through His Studio, Leonardo Answers a Question. This is quite a long title. And Addio, these are some of these fragments, show that during his stay in Rome, Ciardi seems to have developed, or his stay in Rome seems to have prompted him to acknowledge his diasporic legacy and to reconnect with Italian culture and with his own Italianità. Quite a remarkable outcome for a writer who had been very vocal about his Americanness. Indeed, like other American writers of Italian descent, he wanted to avoid being relegated to the category of ethnic writer. And revealing in this respect is an incident involving the peer review, the review of a poem he had written about Italy and Mussolini, which had been published in the Atlantic Monthly. And on that occasion, he reports that poet Robert Lowell acknowledged his poem as, and you can read here both versions of his this quotation by Ciardi, from Ciardi, the best Italian-American poem he had ever seen. This is what Lowell wrote about his poem. And I thought, Ciardi, does this son of a bitch think he is more American than I am? Where does he think I was brought up? Because my name is Ciardi, he decided to hyphenate the poem. Had it been a Yankee name, he would have thought, scholar who knows about Italy. Sure, he made assumptions, but I can't grant for a minute that that Lowell is any more American than I am. And we wish to thank Fred Gardafe for bringing this quotation to our attention. Right. More than half a century after Ciardi, in the academic year 2010-2011, another American poet and scholar of Italian descent, Jennifer Scapettone, became a fellow of the Academy to work on a project entitled Stanza as Homicile, Environments of Exile in Italian Language Arts after World War II. Her award-winning Locomotrix, Selected Poetry and Prose of Amelia Rosselli, published in 2012, was a result of this project, which posited Italy, and I quote from her Scapettone's abstract, as plural, transient, and diasporic patria ideale. So let me just briefly go to the next, the second institution we are taking into account today, which is the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute, which operates under the aegis of Queens College at the City University of New York. It conducts research and publishes a semi-annual academic journal, the Italian American Review, along with other publications produced by Bordighera Press. Founded in 1979 with the aim of redressing imbalances in the treatment of Italian Americans in higher education, the Calandra Institute has grown to encompass a much more varied set of goals. Its commitment to expanding the reach of Italian American studies is testified, among other initiatives, by the Italian American Studies Network formed in Bellagio in 2014, and by pioneering public programming, which is a major component of the Institute's activities. The impact of such programs is far-reaching. For scholars and artists, it provides a forum for making their work known, not only in direct contact with the audience, but also through the online dissemination of their work. Most importantly, little-known subject matter is made more accessible to a wider audience who are seeking knowledge about Italian-American history and culture, which is often not readily available, if not altogether invisible, in the mainstream media. To this regard, two important series were established in 2000 by Joseph Shora, who is the head of the cultural programs at the Calandra Institute. And these are The Writers Read, which invites some of the most prominent Italian-American creative writers to debut and read from works of recent fiction, poetry, and memoir, offering them the opportunity to discuss their works before an audience. And the second program is Documented Italians, a series dedicated to screening independent documentary films and videos that, for the most part, have limited access to commercial theaters and are consequently rarely seen. Likewise relevant is the Philip Canistraro seminar series, which was established in 2005, which focuses on recently published works of scholarship related to Italian American and other diaspora topics. So for this research, we have mined the first program, the Writers Read series, which over the last 2 decades has hosted some of the most cutting-edge authors of the Italian diaspora. What we believe these writers overall testify is that the so-called Italian-American experience is anything but singular, and that Italian-American lives, histories and cultures are diverse and multifaceted, increasingly open to new interpretations and revisions. In fact, their narratives often advance provocative and sometimes disconcerting readings on the larger story of the Italian diaspora, and they often counter the mythic account that chronicles Italian Americans' triumph over deprivation and ethnic discrimination, as well as their ascent into middle and upper middle class success, troubled only by continued depictions of the mafia in cinema and television. As Shora has observed, and I quote, "This uncritical and linear account of self-resolve, family cohesion, and religious conviction ending in the suburbs of white America involves a significant amount of memory loss and obfuscation of the historical record," end of quote. So it is such triumphalism and simplistic assumptions which emerged out of the 1970s white ethnic movement that writers, artists, and scholars are dismantling. So we believe, and I'm concluding here, that by including their perspectives in institutional venues, taking them out of the margin, to quote the title of a seminal anthology, space is made available for creative engagement with identity formation in the various Italian diasporic settings around the globe. And so now I leave the floor to Carla for our case study. Yes.
Okay, so I'll try to get into one of our case studies that are effectively too many, and that's part of the exciting adventure, our research project. We found so many artists worth studying and analyzing because getting in touch with institutions, recognized important institutions, made the difference, in fact. And this applies not only to writers and poets, but also to visual artists, painters, sculptors. We'll talk about Mary Caponegro, who was born in 1956. She was born in Brooklyn, and she had an interesting situation since she was educated for 12 years in a Catholic school, but her Calabrian American father, anyway, decided to keep his Italian family at a distance from Mary. He actually decided to avoid any contact with his family, so to help this younger girl assimilated and integrated into this US social context. So she attended Bard College and then Brown University under the influence of brilliant mentors such as William Gaddis, Robert Kelly, John Oakes, Robert Cooper. She had a very American education, if we may say so. Now she is a professor at Bard College. She teaches literature and writing, and she's in the place where one of her beloved mentors, William Gaddis, once was. Let me show you. Very bad at this. Okay. So she's known as a narrator, as a writer, and as an essayist, and she goes unnoticed in the US landscape, say literary landscape. She's one of those invisible Italian-American writers. I met her many, many years ago, in fact, almost 20 years ago. And she was so convinced that she was American, she was born in the US, educated in the US, and her Italian shade of identity, as I call it, was totally suppressed. This is at least what she said at the very beginning of our contact. Then she started writing, and this is not exactly the way. Ok, Okay, so you can see here a list of the prizes she won. She's in fact, as I told you, was awarded the Rome Prize Fellowship in Literature, and she spent a year residence at the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters in Rome. Of course, she was not the first Italian-American to be awarded the Rome Prize in Writing, as Sabrina said, because that honor went to poet John Ciardi. But she's, though, the first Italian-American woman to receive this important fellow. Her long stay in Italy was determinant, I believe. It was in 1991, provided her with the time to connect with her distant Italian origins. To learn the language, she had time to collaborate with other artists, once again seeking ways to expand what her art can do. In the palatial complex on the Gianicolo, where the Rome American Academy is, she met, in fact, a sculptor, Rita McBride, and together they published an interesting book, a prestigious hand-printed book entitled The Change. Quite a metaphor, in fact. The book deals with the story of Apollo and Daphne as narrated from the point of view of Daphne in a post-feminist, postmodernist perspective. It was printed by Gunnar Caldwell, the husband of a composer, Bang Chi Lam. They were both fellows at the Rome American Academy, and the book, strangely and curiously, is sort of an anticipation of the kind of metamorphosis that Caponegro was about to live in her life, in fact. So she started, as I told you, as an invisible Italian-American writer with no evident signs of Italianity in her work, and ended up, as we'll see in a moment, writing an Italian-American novel entitled Chinese Chocolate, on which she's been working now for more than 10 years, in fact. So the year in Rome served as an inspiration for many other works she wrote. See if I have it here. Maybe it was before. Eccoli, exactly. So I'm thinking about the collection, Five Doubt, which is 1998, so 7 years after her long stay in Rome, and then the stories in The Complexities of Intimacy, written over the same period of time when she was working on the Italian stories. Okay. So Mary Caponegro's true matter has to do with her light touch, her wit, her humor. She has a great sense of the craft of writing, a great capacity to deal with the most realistic concerns in a way that allows us to look at them anew, as if from another planet. She adapted her style to a great variety of topics, and her characters are troubled people who feel ill at ease in the world and question the reality of things, and most of all, they question their own identity, which, studying her works, seemed to me a great sign of Italianity, in fact. This does not mean, however, they are not depressive nor grim characters. On the contrary, they are even humorous and funny in a way. But what is particularly interesting is her last novel, Chinese Chocolate, a novel about growing up as an Italian-American Catholic in suburbia in the 60s, when ethnicity elicited more ambivalence than pride. The novel is much more conventional than Caponegro's earlier work, though it also employs some kind of surrealism anyway. The formation of attitudes about gender and sexuality is the core of the novel anyway. But this is a Bildungsroman that does not gloss over the past or explain the mysteries of experience, but it actually deals with the past, which is quite an important aspect of her production. Let me show you. Okay. So she keeps writing about something biographical. Looking closer at Caponegro's work, we can't help noticing a critical shift, sometimes like a change of rhythm, a change of pace in her writing, which is the consequence of her first experiences at the Rome American Academy. And it is also the consequence of the reading she had at the John Calandra American Institute in 2010, and even of the 4 weeks she spent near this wonderful place, in fact, in Umpertide, at the Civitella Ranieri, all experienced, followed by an increasingly growing awareness of the Italian shade in her identity. She says, collaborations in Rome and all over Italy were very inspiring and stimulating to me. So, as she openly declares in an interview with François Palot-Papin in 2002, she slowly changed her attitude towards biography and autobiography, as you can see here. She talks about autobiographical material, and she defines it interesting. When I was a fledgling writer, she says, in college I studied poetry and wrote many bad confessional poems. My earliest undergraduate attempts story were bad, she says, but my orientation as a mature fiction writer has always been toward invention. As you can see in the second quote, something has changed. Lately, she says, I have wanted to challenge myself by tackling subjects or approaches I would have previously eschewed. In the collection I'm working on now, I have included one story that involves an adolescent girl in Catholic school. This is so close to my own life that I would never have gone anywhere near it before, considering it unworthy and uninteresting. But I felt at this point of my life, at this juncture of my life, the need to explore this subject matter. So I wonder, where does this need to explore a subject matter very close to our own life come from? What determined such a change in her style? And how can we as critics, feel entitled to interpret that autobiographical element as a sign of Italianità? And also, how can we link these signs of Italianità to our Italian experience? Well, we can do so only paying attention to what slowly but continuously changes in her production after her stay in Rome. Let me show you something. Okay, this is Blossom Kirschbaum that talks about her, and he says, we read, sorry, I lost the original. Okay. Her case, cioè Caponegro's case, seems typical of Italian Americans who sojourn in Italy to reconnect with roots and to revitalize and extend a binational life. As a matter of fact, after 1991, she published 3 collections of short stories: 5 Doubts, 1998, The Complexities of Intimacy, 2001, and All Fall Down, 2009. The most interesting is 5 Doubts, published in 1998. The stories here, like those in The Star Café, are connected thematically and stylistically, but also are connected by a single inspirational technique. Each story launches itself from an image or from a text coming from Italian history, culture, and art. For example, Il Libro dell'Arte, The Apprentice as Mistress, is inspired by Cennino d'Andrea Cennini's Il Libro dell'Arte. The Spectacle is inspired by a mosaic depicting a tiger being captured and their attention distracted by a mirrored sphere. This comes from the great hunting room of Piazza Armerina in Sicily. Or Tombola, a short story entitled Tombola, comes from a Neapolitan Tombolone game board. This is in this book, actually. So if you want to give it a look, please, you can look at it. And then Etruscan Catechism is by a Tarquinian tomb painting of a bull running toward 2 men having sex in a field. And the last short story, Doubt, Uncertainty, Possibility, Desire, comes from a detail from Andrea del Verrocchio, Baptism of Christ, with 2 angels on the Savior's right, one of them thought to have been painted by Leonardo da Vinci. So what we see, actually, is that Italian art, visual art, images come into her writing in such a way. So let me show you. You have the short story, and juxtaposed, you have the image. So, of course, this goes on for the story I've mentioned, and please feel free to look at it. So, let's try to conclude. Okay, this is the reading she gave from All Fall Down on September 2010 at the John Calandra Italian American Institute. And collaborations in Rome, and this is The Change, the book I mentioned before. This is part of some critique you can actually easily find on Caponegro, because before, let's say 1998, before this book, Five Doubts, she was acknowledged as an American writer. No one made any kind of reference to her Italian origins and story. Okay, and this is her last stay, which was in Civitella Ranieri Foundation, and this is my translation of what she said, in fact, which is, of course, acknowledging the importance of being there. While in residence at Civitella, I made substantial progress on my novel, because part of the narrative is set in Italy, and because its imagery draws heavily from masterworks of Italian art. So Civitella was the ideal location for me to write. Okay, I'm almost done. So the daughter of a Calabrian descendant father and German descendant mother, because that's her story, she lacks, as we said before, early influence from the Italian half of her heritage, as Fred Gardefeu noticed some years ago, actually some decades before, and therefore produces works informed by what he calls a reformed sense of Italianità, based on, among other things, new encounters with contemporary and historical Italy. So she did not grow up in an Italian-American suburb, but the novel she's working on focuses on a young girl living in an Italian suburb. So she sort of reinvented her Italianness. Educated at Bar College and Broad University, she was immensely distant from any possible connections with Italian-American influence. Thus, she's more likely to reveal a connection to the work of Sorrentino, for example, or De Lillo, because of her anti-mimetic fiction. So, in this current phase of her career, now, I mean, because we exchanged emails last week, Caponegro says that she wants to dabble occasionally in a realm closer to what she curiously starts calling home. She starts talking about going on, coming home, even though her fiction still displays a high degree of artifice and emotional intensity. So in this same year, in 2014, in the same year she spent the 4 weeks at Civitella Ranieri, she was also the core of an international conference organized by the University of Udine. And the theme of the discussion was, in fact, her experimental character. The topic of her Italian-American shade of identity was only in my paper, as most of the other relations continued dealing with the experimental features of her writing. Back then, when I talked to her, she seemed still very convinced that her Italian-American identity was very far from being manifested in her novel, and it probably would never do. Now, a week ago, she writes that she feels she's coming on. She feels this happened because of the real contact, she says, with the land. She was particularly impressed by Umbria, by this staying in the countryside. She talks about colors and rhythms and animals and landscapes and sunsets and so on and so on. And so what seems clear, so to conclude, what seems clear now is that thanks to institutions such as the Roma American Academy, the John Calandra Italian-American Institute, in this case the Civitella Ranieri Foundation, Caponegro changed, and she says so, her point of view on her own composite and complicated identity. She seems to me to leave the door open to future possibilities of ethnic manifestations as an Italian-American writer. She seems also more and more entitled to speak in the name of the Italian-American community, even though she was not given a chance to belong there in her crucial years as a child and as a young woman. So a new sense of reformed Italianità can also be the outcome of support by recognized institutions to Italian-American artists in the difficult process of getting in touch with their subtly ethnic shades of identity. Thank you.
Thank you. her case seems to be like Tom Wolfe. You can never go home again. We have a little bit more than 10 minutes. If there are any questions, observations from the peanut gallery. Roberto? I think you need a mic.
Actually, mine is not a question to Valenzani, but I was sadly noticing that what you said about the stereotypes about Italy, I don't know if you saw the White Lotus, this series, TV series that was broadcasted, I don't know, 1 year ago. And the second season of the White Lotus is located in Taormina. And it narrates the history, the holiday of some Americans in Taormina during a week. And all the stereotypes you showed are actually the same until now, so after 70 years. So I was wondering why nothing changed. And also I was thinking about what they are saying is the opinion maybe of the white Americans, but not the Americans in general. So it would be interesting to think about that and why they only, or maybe only the white Americans, and why after 70 years are at the same point.
Yeah, I would say that the travel writings, travel articles and travel guides in the United States during the 50s were, let's say, an expression of white American world. Okay, for example, I have found no example of travel writings about Italy written by someone with an Italian surname. No? So there are very few examples actually of Italian Americans writing about their impressions as tourists during the 50s. Actually, and perhaps this is most interesting, they tend to focus about the political situation in Italy. For example, they stated that, there was a slide I had no time to show you, but they stated that Italian communists, for example, were not so bad as one might imagine because they were not associated with Moscow, with the Socialist Soviet Union, but they were communist Italian style, which means something less harmful than a true communist. So they tended to focus on specific questions, but there are very few cases about Italian-American travel writing about Italy in this phase of history, as mostly of the travel articles and the tourists were WASP American, I would say.
Hold on.
Following up on that, I wanted to ask, have you seen any, I mean, today there's a big, strong effort for heritage tourism. Many, many tours are being found. Go back and find your roots, go back and find your roots, which would not have happened back then. I was the first of my family to come, and I didn't come till the 1970s, and they all asked me, why are you going there? There's no milk, there's no bathrooms, there's no, they're all communists, etc. Did you come across, was there any attempt in what you researched to look at, to reach the Italian-American community to try to bring them?
No, that's another interesting point, that a magazine such as Italy's Life, for example, Italy's Life was distributed to people who subscribe to the newspaper, okay? And I have the list of people who subscribed, and many of them were people with Italian surnames, so I suspect Italian Americans. But in the articles, in the newspaper, there was no attempt to advertise this sense of heritage to Italian American people. It was a magazine that only talked about Italian art, Italian culture, and Italian actor, Italian actress in Italy. So in the advertisement, in the print advertisement, there were no mentions about Italian Americans or any attempt to use this sense of heritage from Italians. I suspect that this was also because of the traditional embarrassment of the Italian government developed under fascism, for example, which under fascism, for example, Enid stopped to use folklore yeah, exactly. They completely disappear from the advertisement because it seems like the Italietta, the Italy from the Paesani, and so, yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to address the question of Italian-American identity. As an Italian-American myself, one thing I learned when I returned, when return is not the right word, began to visit Italy, is that my roots are not are in the south of Italy. And my understanding is that Italian identity, not Italian-American identity, was something that had to be created, perhaps in the 20th century. My parents spoke a southern dialect, Sicilian and Campagnese, and they discouraged me from understanding what they were saying because they had experienced a great degree of prejudice, although they had been born in the U.S. So my point is simply that the complexity of being an Italian-American is also the suppression of my roots in the South. I love Umbria, I love Rome, but it has very little to do with the history of my family. I don't know about Caponegro, whether she's from Lazio or not.
So her father was from Calabria, in fact, and what happens was exactly what you have just said. She tried hard to understand what he said when he spoke dialect with his mother, and she was not only discouraged, but physically brought somewhere else. She narrates in a short story, which sounds particularly autobiographical, that all the kids were left alone in a room as long as they would play, they could do whatever they wanted, but they could not try to speak Italian, no way. So she was actually separated, and she, in particular, she narrates a kind of pain linked to the separation from her grandmother, whom she loved immensely. And she she writes that she actually understood this woman, even though she could hardly grasp the words, but she used so many gestures, so communication was no problem. But her father was Calabrian, was from Calabria. When she came back to Italy, I wouldn't say she returned, in fact that's a very problematic word, but when she came visiting Italy, she attempted to go to Calabria, and there she visited the region where her father was from. Actually, her father's village was one of those ghost villages that was actually abandoned. And so she was particularly shocked by this idea of death that actually circulated in these small villages. She showed me the photographs and she was like, how is it possible that nobody does anything for these small villages? And then she realized we have thousands of those small villages to restore. But what actually, what she actually narrated was the feeling of not belonging there, no way. I mean, she felt she belonged to Rome, because she was sort of reborn in Rome. She always talks about being born again at the Rome American Academy as well as here in Umbria. But she doesn't feel any kind of connection with the South, probably because she didn't even hear a story from her father. He actually was silent, that's what she says, was very silent about his origin. You're welcome.
Thank you for all your presentations. I was wondering about about Giuliano's presentation and about the questions that were raised and the observations made. I was wondering, whether, of course, in the 50s, when your research is focused, the question was very much to convince Americans to travel to Italy, and therefore the demographics was really affluent Americans. And so that's one thing that ties to to the other questions that were raised. But the other thing I think is also the I don't know how to call this, but maybe structures or reasons for mobility. So maybe someone from an Italian-American background who could eventually go back to Italy and visit his family or her family would not feel like a tourist. So tourism and, how to say, you know, family relations or some other affection that motivated traveling was something that also was part of the picture. I was really impressed by the you know, continuous use of specific stereotypes about the Italian population, but I wanted to share with you just a little, like a sentence from a longer essay by Leslie Fiedler, who in 1957 published this very interesting essay about how the American taste for Italian literature could not be separated from the taste of young affluent Americans for things Italian in general. And the way in which he described it's kind of funny, but it goes straight into what you brought up in the advertisements. Because he says, I have to sit down because otherwise I can't read. The tastes of the American publics, highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow, have been educated to Italian paintings, poems, and novels by being exposed to certain Italian modes of feeling and perception symbolized by the black sleeves of Anna Magnani, the lovely ugliness of Giulietta Masina, the breasts of Gina Lollobrigida. In fact, it is Gina who embodies for us the Provinciale of Alberto Moravia, perhaps before we have even read the story. So, which is exactly the stereotype, and it was Leslie Fiedler, you know, one of the finest cultural critics. Well, it was Canadian, but it was based in the US. So I think it's interesting, this kind of recycling, this recirculation of images that come from popular culture, from the past, and the advertisement seems to have been one of the largest sources for the recirculation of those ideas. Sorry for taking so long, but I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's funny.
Let me add this too, and this is relevant to both topics: the idea of Italy trying to sell, and then the idea of rediscovering. But during the same time that you're studying, two important films or popular films appear out of Hollywood. One is Roman Holidays, and the other is Three Coins in a Fountain. And that contributes to a type of stereotyping. And there's also, in 1951, the famous photograph, if not infamous photograph, by Ruth Orkin, which is the American Girl in Italy, where these guys are grabbing themselves as this woman walks by, right? So in a sense, that's contributing to the whole set of stereotypes. And Roberto, the one thing you left out about White Lotus is that there are three generations of Italian-American men: son, father, and grandfather. And there's sort of, and it's a type of return that you guys were speaking about. At this point, we're 2 minutes into your coffee hour. Dare I take 2 minutes from your coffee pause? So why don't we pause and we can chat about this and other things then. Thank you.